Chapter 18. The town of Green River seemed quiet and peaceful after dark. The streets were empty, save for the horses tied up at various hitch rails in front of the saloons, hotels, and a few other establishments which were still open late into the evening. The night air was cool and fresh, and the sky above was clear and studded with stars. The sounds of crickets melted into the tinny sound of a piano in one of the saloons. The Laredo Kid angled his horse off to the side of the street and tied up in front of the Longhorn. The place was much more alive tonight than it had been the last time he had been there. A horde of gamblers sat around the many tables, and the chink of chips being tossed into the various pots rang out above the low rumble of voices. Laredo stood just inside the door, his eyes methodically scanning the room, looking for Seth Bascom. Bascom saw him first, placed his game on hold, and rose to meet him, carry his drink in one hand. "Over here," he said brusquely, and brushed past him toward a small table in a far corner away from the crowd. They sat down without a word. Bascom set his drink down on the table, reached inside his gray coat pocket, and retrieved a cigar. He took his time lighting it, then sat back in his chair, took a puff, and expelled the smoke casually. "King's woman was in today," Bascom said idly. "Claims you're a fake, that you're not King's son. Seems like big trouble to me." "Fortunately, King still believes I'm his son," the kid said. "Figures the old lady is just ranting and raving just to get rid of me. He thinks she's afraid I'm cutting her out of inheriting the ranch. King and the missus haven't been getting along for a long time now. They've had separate rooms for several years now, but he won't divorce her." "So how's the old man dealing with these accusations?" Bascom asked. "He's hoping she'll calm down and accept things for the way they are. He thought I should spend the night in town tonight to give her a chance to simmer down." Pike took another puff on his cigar. "So you're sure you're still in with King?" "Isn't that what I just said?" The kid answered with annoyance. Bascom didn't answer, then said casually, "Pike tells me you're ready to play ball." "Don't seem to have much choice, do I?" "A man always has choices," Bascom said, "but he doesn't always have the courage to make them. Somehow, I never saw you as lacking in courage. I wanted to play things my way, but right now, it seems I've got way too many partners. So, I guess I have to make some concessions. At first, I thought I could eliminate King with an accident, so there would be no suspicions about me inheriting the royal crown so soon after my arrival here. It wasn't in my plan to go after Darrow's spread too. Like you said before, there's no need to be greedy, but you and your boys messed all my plans up by stirring up the Darrow and royal feud. Now Darrow thinks I'm with him, and I've got a chance on grabbing both spreads. Not for greed, but because I just plain don't like Darrow," Laredo stated. "Now that the feud has been ignited, we might as well keep it going until the two factions fight it out. King takes a bullet, and Darrow takes the blame. The problem is, I told Darrow I was going to do it the way I had first planned it. He's going to be holding back any action on his part until I eliminate King, so your boys are going to have to keep hitting the royal crown, making it look like Darrow's work. Now King won't be on his feet for at least a week. He's already mad enough to ride against Darrow now, but he can't. Any more trouble is only going to push him further into getting on a horse as soon as he can. The only problem is, we have to make sure that King goes down in the fight." "That should be easy enough to arrange," Bascom smiled. "Pike will see to it." "That's the problem," Laredo said grimly, his steely eyes boring holes into Bascom's. "I like to make sure a job is done right, so I like to do it myself. King Royal is mine. Understand?" Bascom thought for a moment. Then he bent forward over the table until his face was inches from Laredo's. His dark eyes were grim and menacing. "I understand," he almost growled. "And like I said before, I understand you are a very dangerous man. But you understand this. You've shoved a gun into my face twice before, and I have no reason to trust you. You cross me up, the next time you pull a gun on me, you'd better use it." "You can count on it," Laredo said flatly. Sam Corday stepped out onto his wooden porch. He was still in a stupor from his drinking the night before. He had become sullen and morose since Millie ran off. The whiskey only made him meaner. His eyes squinted into the rising sun, and he lifted his shotgun in warning at the approaching buckboard as it lumbered down the trail toward his place. "Go back," he ordered. "Get off my land. No trespassers allowed." The buckboard kept coming. He pulled back a hammer on the shotgun and let one barrel loose, firing high, only trying to scare the newcomers off with a thundering shot. The driver of the buckboard pulled up on the reins and rolled to a halt. The team of horses were shying and stamping in their traces. Sam could hear the whinnies. "Just want to talk," a feminine voice sounded. "About your daughter." Corday strained his eyes to make out who it was. Finally, he could make out the driver and the woman sitting next to him. If they, in fact, did have information about Millie, he decided he could let them through. "All right, come on in. No funny business, or my aim will be better next time." The buckboard rolled forward. "What the hell?" he thought as he recognized the woman as Florence Royal. "Hold it right there, Mrs. Royal," Corday shouted. "Now that I see who you are, you'd better hightail it out of here pronto. I don't care if you are a woman. I'll shoot you down like I would any other royal caught on my place. I was told that your daughter, Millie, ran off with my son, Luke. I need to know if that's true," she shouted. "Millie ran off by herself," Corday answered. "Luke's dead." It was as if a hammer had hit her in the head. Her knees felt weak, and her whole body trembled as she heard the word dead. She scarcely heard Sam Corday add, "Johnny Royal shot him." The words finally seeped into her brain, but tears did not come right away. "He's not Johnny Royal," she blurted. "The man's an imposter, and now you say he killed Luke." "That's the truth of it," Corday answered. "He really is Johnny Royal, though," he added. Then, with a touch of delight and adding to Florence's sorrow, he said, "But he's not King's son. He's Harvey Darrow's son." It was late afternoon when Johnny returned to the Royal Crown Ranch House. He didn't know what to expect. Would Florence still be on a rampage claiming he was a fraud? And what of King? How was he handling the situation? A feeling of dread fell over him as he stepped into the vestibule. Lila and Heather greeted him with grimness on their faces. "King's in his study," Lila said. "He wants to see you right away." The urgency in her voice was near hysteria, and for once, Heather was not her frivolous self. Something was definitely wrong. Johnny brushed past the two girls, sweeping his broad-brimmed range hat off as he hurried across the room. King was behind his desk, taking a swallow from one of the bottles that Doc Tatum had given him. He looked up as Johnny came in and shut the door. There was a look of relief on his face as he said, "Johnny, I'm glad you're back. We got more trouble. Sam Corday has Florence. He's holding her hostage up on the wishbone." He blurted it out as if unable to say it fast enough. "What the hell is she doing up there?" Johnny asked with exasperation. "That fool woman went up there looking for Luke. She had one of the men drive her up, and he just got back a few minutes ago. Corday told him to tell me that he wants to exchange her for you. If you're not there by tomorrow morning, he'll kill her. I'm not sure if it's just a threat or if he really is capable of it. He's a stupid, drunken old man. Who knows what he will or won't do? He was quite put out that Darrow didn't want to kill me yesterday," Johnny said. "Johnny," King said almost apologetically, "as I've always said, Florence is a witch, but she's my witch. I wouldn't want to see any harm come to her, but if it's a matter of your life, or her life, I'm not so sure she's worth the risk." Johnny grinned slightly. "Well, old man," he said, "I'm not about to let you off the hook so easily. I'll bring her back. You both deserve it." The riders waited patiently in the shadow of the trees. Their horses occasionally stamped impatiently beneath them, forcing them to keep the mounts under control. Any sound could carry a far distance in the still of the night, and they didn't want to alert any of the range crew who were on duty watching the main herd here on the East Range. The air was cool compared to the daytime heat, but all in all, it was a pleasant night except for the mosquitoes and other flying insects that seemed to annoy the horses incessantly. The moon was growing larger now, as the month wore on, and from their vantage point at the top of a wooded hill, they could look down on the valley filled with milling cattle. They could plainly hear the sounds of their lowing and stamping. They could see the night riders circling the herd, and occasionally they could hear them singing to soothe the restless animals. "Looks quiet," Pike said. "There seems to be more night hawks and more men in camp than usual, but we'll be hitting them with surprise, so we should be able to handle them all right. Let's do it." He pulled the bandana up over the lower part of his face and kicked his horse forward. His companions followed suit, and as a unit, the 5 horsemen bolted out of the brush, down the grass-covered knoll, their pistols out and firing haphazardly to frighten the cows into stampede. Almost immediately, the whole herd was on its feet and running wild into the west. The nighthawkers, taken by surprise, were caught up in the ocean of terrified steers. One horse stumbled, and the rider went down under a flurry of hooves. Another managed to sidestep his mount out of the way and veer off at a gallop away from the thundering herd. The outlaws rode in closer to the herd, shouting and shooting, encouraging the cattle to keep running. But as they came close, riding parallel with the herd, firing came from the camp. Flames spat from many Colt muzzles, and the reports thundered above the din of the running herd, surprising Pike and his men. They had not expected so many men to be in camp. With the first volley, Ike Mannon took a bullet in his side. He slumped forward and his mount staggered into Pike's, pushing him closer to the herd. With reflex action, Pike pushed back, giving himself room to swing away from the herd. Mannon spilled from the saddle and rolled into the path of the frenzied cattle. His scream was drowned out by the stamping feet. Pike motioned to his remaining men to follow him. It was time to clear out. They had accomplished what they had set out to do. The cattle were now running wild, fast and furious. Nothing would stop them now. As they started to pull away, shadows swept over the horizon to their right. The vague shape of riders and horses were highlighted against the darkening sky. They came riding fast, spread out in a line. Probably at least a dozen riders, Pike thought. Their guns were blazing as they raced forward. Darrell Porter took a bullet and fell from the saddle. The other 3 whipped up their mounts and spurred them on. The riders behind them had closed the gap. Bullets flew around the outlaws' heads like a nest of angry bees. Leo Pratt took a wound in the shoulder. His horse stumbled, but he held on, pushing on steadily, though the horse was faltering. A bullet sliced through the crown of Pike's hat, and it fell forward over his face, held in place by a chin strap. He whipped it off and let it fall. Faster and faster he pushed his mount, his remaining 2 men trailing and falling behind until the firing behind them dwindled and finally ceased as the pursuing riders pulled back and put their attentions to the stampeding herd. The outlaws never bothered to look back. They just kept on riding. Pike was cursing to himself. He was sure they had been betrayed. The Royal Crown men had been expecting them, and the only person who could have tipped them off was the Laredo Kid. It was dark by the time Johnny had reached the Wishbone Ranch house. Lights were ablaze inside, and their glow spilled through the windows out into the yard. He reined his black horse up in the shadows of the cottonwoods, as close to the house as he dared to avoid being seen. He sat the saddle, holding the reins of the black tight in his left hand. With his right hand, he reached into his cartridge belt and retrieved a bullet. He flung it against the front window hard enough to shatter the glass and fall inside the house. At the same time, he yelled out, "Corday! Sam Corday! It's Johnny Royal. I'm here to trade for Mrs. Royal." The shotgun barrel poked through the same broken window with the sound of more broken glass. Come into the light where I can see you, Corday shouted. No deal, Corday, Johnny answered. You let Mrs. Royal go and I'll come out. Hell, he said. I might as well kill her then and be done with it. Sam, Johnny retorted. You kill her, I'll kill you. Simple as that. Now all you have to do is put her in a buckboard and have Larry drive her out. Once they are out of the driveway, I'll toss out my guns and come out. How do I know I can trust you? Sam blustered. If I don't do as I say, you can always call Larry back, and you'll still have Mrs. Royal. Why should you give your life for that old witch? Corday questioned. Because I'm King Royal's son, and he wants me to get her back. I'm gambling that you won't shoot me. I thought you said you were Harvey Darrow's son. The old man seemed confused. I only told him that so he would let me go. So you admit you're a liar. I knew you couldn't be trusted. All right, Sam, Johnny said with resolution. Here's how it plays out. You don't send Mrs. Royal out. I'm assuming you're going to kill her anyways, so I'm coming in there shooting, and I don't care who dies. But if you let her go, you've got me. What'll be? I'm not waiting all night? Sam considered it for a while. He glanced at Florence sitting tied to a straight chair behind him. Larry said, Pa, I don't want you to kill him, Mrs. Royal. I'll do as he says. Damn, Sam thought. Why was it always so difficult to make decisions? Then he turned back to the window and shouted, All right, we've got a deal. I'm sending her out with Larry. Then you're dealing with me without your guns. Let's see it then, Sam. I want to see 'em on their way now, Johnny ordered. Corday felt a shiver go up his spine. He sure hoped he knew what he was doing. Chapter 19. Johnny watched as Larry hitched up a team to the buckboard and then ushered Florence out of the house and onto the seat of the wagon. He climbed aboard, took up the reins, and clucked the team forward until he reached the end of the driveway and pulled to a halt. All right, Johnny, Corday yelled. Toss your guns out and step into the light where I can see you. Larry's not taking her any farther until you do. Johnny tossed out one pistol. It landed in the dirt close to the porch. Then he tossed out the other one and slowly stepped forward, hands raised, until he stood in the light from the house. The shotgun barrel disappeared from the window momentarily, and then Sam Corday stepped out onto the porch. He forced a smile of victory, but his knees were trembling and the big, heavy shotgun waved unsteadily in his hands. All right, Larry, he shouted. Drive on. Johnny waited calmly for Corday's next move and watched the team and buckboard descend down the trail to the valley below, following the winding, rutted road. Corday was taking his time, watching them go also, and trying to make up his mind if he could really shoot down Johnny Royal, and for the first time, he realized the reality of it all. No longer could he just bluster threats about killing. Now was the time to do it. Well, Sam, Johnny said coolly, are you going to get this thing over with or not? Flustered by the coolness, Sam answered somewhat nervously, You in a hurry to die, boy? No, Sam, I'm not. Are you? Mighty big talk for a fella in your position, Royal. I'm the one with the gun. What do you think King's going to do to you if you kill me? Johnny tossed that out, waited a moment, then added, Think about it, Sam. I don't care. King killed Danny, and you're to blame for Millie running off like she done. Corday was starting to mumble now. Millie ran off with Luke. She was going to do that anyway, Johnny said. Luke's dead, Sam shouted. No, Sam. He was merely passed out at the pond. When he came to, he went to the house and let Millie out of her room. She tended his wounds, and then they took off. If you hadn't gone to the Arrow D, and if you hadn't left Larry guarding me in the tack room, they never could have gotten away. So you see, Sam, it's all your own fault. Killing me isn't going to change that. Corday was more confused now than ever. He just couldn't seem to think straight. What to do? Then without thought, the decision was made. The shotgun barrels lifted, pointing directly at Johnny's chest. "It's not my fault," he raged as his finger tightened on the triggers. All of a sudden, the earth seemed to shake beneath his feet, and the walls of his run-down house started to vibrate. Glass shattered from windows. A thundering roar grew louder from the east behind him. "What's he?" His attention was suddenly distracted from Johnny and looked to his left and to the east. A giant mass of moving shadow was spreading into the valley below, and directly in its path, straight ahead of it, was the buckboard carrying Larry and Florence Royal. Johnny immediately recognized what was happening. "Stampede! Larry and Mrs. Royal will be killed if we don't do something," he shouted, turned and ran back to his horse. Sam Corday could shoot him if he wanted to, but he had to go after that buckboard. Sam Corday was dumbfounded. All he could think of was Larry in front of another stampeding herd. "No!" he cried, dropping the shotgun and running to the corral for a horse. Johnny put the black into a fast gallop and angled away from the trail to shortcut across the valley and ride in between the oncoming herd and the buckboard farther down the trail. Larry had already realized the danger and had whipped the team into a full gallop. The wagon slewed left and right and bumped high as it rolled over hillocks and rocks strewn along the trail. Florence hung onto the seat rails for dear life, screaming at the top of her lungs. Her whole body shook with fear. Johnny pulled his horse to a sliding stop sideways in the trail. He had pulled his Winchester from the saddle boot and levered 6 evenly spaced shots into the air while waving his arms frantically at the oncoming herd. Their pace never slackened. The frightened animals kept right on rumbling toward him. Realizing it was no use trying to stop the herd, he wheeled the skittish black around and sent him galloping pall-mall after the fleeing buckboard. As he came close behind the wagon and just starting to come alongside it on a curve in the road, the front left wheel of the buckboard caught the side of a boulder on the other side of the road. The vehicle leaped upward, front wheels lifting off the trail, and crashed back down. The wagon tongue kingpin broke loose, and the team ran off free with Larry still clinging to the reins and being catapulted from the seat, flying through the air and landing on the ground and being dragged by the fleeing team. At the same time, the buckboard upended, tossing Florence to the ground alongside as it rolled onto its left side, hanging by the rear wheels at an angle across the trail. As she rolled right into the path of Johnny's horse, Johnny yanked the reins hard, pulling the black's neck sharply right and high. The horse skidded, twisted, and turned away from the rolling body. Johnny leaped to the right, landing in the dirt beside Florence as his mount kicked up his heels and took off across country away from the oncoming herd. Johnny quickly retained his bearings. He jumped to his feet and ran to Florence. She was still screaming and sobbing as he pulled her from the ground and practically dragged her toward the overturned buckboard. He looked up and saw the herd practically on top of them. With a mighty heave, he tossed Florence forward underneath the wrecked wagon and dove in after her, covering her body with his and holding her down while he ducked his head and cringed low on the ground. He could no longer see the herd from this position. He could only hear the rumbling hooves of the bellowing cattle. They lay there for several minutes, which seemed like an eternity, listening to the roar, feeling the cattle pass by and brush against their meager shelter, kicking dust and dirt over them. Then, as the rumbling began to subside and recede into the west, Johnny brought his head up and looked out. He saw the last straggling cattle passing by, and cowboys up ahead, strung out alongside the herd on both sides trying to contain them. He rolled back from Florence, giving her room to turn over and rise. She was hysterical, sobbing and babbling incoherently. Johnny pulled her to a sitting position and hugged her against his chest, stroking her matted hair and speaking low and calm, trying to soothe her. She was starting to calm down as a rider pulled up alongside. It was Denver Blaine. He quickly dismounted, and as he squatted down beside them, he recognized Johnny Royal and Florence. He was a bit surprised to find them out here in the middle of all this mayhem. "Are you two all right?" was his first concern. "Mrs. Royal is frightened out of her wits. Can you get someone to help me take care of her and get her back to the ranch?" "Sure, I'll get someone to ride back to camp and get the chuck wagon. We can take her home in that." Then he said, "Sure am sorry you got caught in this mess. We didn't expect those sidewinders to hit us so soon, especially not tonight, but we were ready for them just in case." "It's okay, Denver," Johnny said. "You had no way of knowing we'd be here. I'm the one who put them in harm's way. But I didn't know it either." Then he said, "Now hurry and get some help for Mrs. Royal." Denver was back in a matter of minutes with 2 cowhands to attend to Florence. Another one had been sent for the wagon. Johnny left her in their hands and crawled out from under the wrecked buckboard. The herd had become a slower mass of shadow down the trail as they slowed down, having spent themselves and the rest of the Royal Crown waddies herding them under control. Not far from the wreckage, a solitary horse stood ground hitched. In front of him, the shape of a large man kneeled on the ground in shadow. Johnny strode over to the man. He was sure what he would find. And he was right. It was Sam Corday. He was now on both knees, hardly able to hold himself up, and he was crying over Larry's trampled remains. Johnny came up behind him and placed his hands, reassuringly, on the big man's shaking shoulders. He did not speak. Sam needed to cry, and he certainly didn't need to hear the voice of the man he had just recently vowed to kill. He was trampled once before. Why did he have to die this way? Sam sobbed. Wasn't once enough? Johnny faded away into the darkness as 2 of Blaine's riders came to help Corday. He mounted up and rode back to the ranch house to retrieve his guns. The body was so mutilated, the waddies offered to bury it right there in the valley, but Corday refused. He wanted to take care of it himself. The ranch hands provided a canvas tarp to wrap the remains in and loaded it across the saddle of Sam's horse as the old man had requested. From a distance, Johnny watched the old man walk away, heading back home and leading the horse with its lifeless load. He felt sorry for the old man. Sam Corday had threatened to kill him, but Johnny could understand the man's anger and couldn't blame him. After all, he was guilty for much of what had happened, himself. If he hadn't tried to pass himself off as King Royal's son, perhaps things might have worked out differently. But then Johnny thought, Bascom, he's really to blame. And he had been a fool to ever play along with a man like that. Now he was going to have to confront his own deceit. Blaine's men had retrieved the bodies of the 2 fallen outlaws, so Johnny knew that Pike Grant and 2 other riders had gotten away. Unless he missed his guess, Pike would be after him seeking revenge. His life wouldn't be worth a plugged nickel if he didn't get to Pike first. Assuming that Pike would hightail it to town and report to Bascom, Johnny turned his horse and rode toward Green River. Pike and his remaining 2 companions guided their mounts through a stand of bush into an open area where they could rest themselves and their horses. Leo Pratt was leaning way over the neck of his horse, barely hanging on. "Leo's hit real bad, Pike," Butch Kenyon said, sliding from his saddle and reaching up to help Pratt off. He practically fell off as Butch pulled his arm. He slammed onto his back into the wet grass of nighttime. "We may have to leave him be," Pike said, watching from his perch in the saddle. Butch looked up and said, "He's already dead." "3 men dead," Pike groaned. "And I know whose fault it is. And when I see him, I'm going to kill that dirty double-crosser." Then he repeated his vow, "I'm going to kill the Laredo Kid." Chapter 20. Johnny was long gone when Sam Corday arrived back at his ranch. His brain was too fogged to think. He wanted to take the body into town so Larry could be buried in the cemetery next to his ma and Danny. He would have to wait for daylight before he could start out. So what to do with Larry? He couldn't have it in the house with him, and he couldn't leave him outside. He led his horse into the barn, raked some straw up into a pile, then let the canvas-covered body slip carefully to the floor. He knelt beside the body and started to cry again. His shoulders shook violently, and his knees went out from him. He fell into a sitting position, and then rolled over onto the floor, sobbing in the lonely darkness until he became so tired that he began to drift off to sleep with one last conscious thought of what he knew he had to do. Florence had finally calmed down by the time Blaine and his men brought her to the ranch house. Elvira had fixed her some hot broth and tea as she relaxed in an overstuffed chair in the living room. Lila and Heather were seated opposite her on the sofa. They were still in their nightgowns and robes and were very much disturbed over their mother's ordeal. King shuffled into the room, wearing robe and slippers and leaning on his crutch. Florence looked up from over her teacup and saw him standing there, looking down at her. She set her cup down and gazed up at him. "You're to blame for all of this, King. If you hadn't brought Johnny here, none of this would ever have happened." "So you're calling him Johnny now?" King chided. "Are you convinced now that he really is my son?" "Yes, King," she almost hissed it. "He's your son, all right. He's just like you." "But he did save your life," King reminded her. "Yes," she agreed, "but as I said, he's just like you." "Settle down, Pike," Seth Bascom said, rubbing the back of his neck nervously and pacing back and forth in his room. "It's not going to do any good, going off half-cocked. I know it looks like the kid double-crossed us, but why? He's got more to lose than we have." "I think he's soft," Pike blurted. "He's got too much conscience to be part of a deal like this." "Maybe," Bascom agreed, "but we need him for the plan to work. He'll be a meal ticket for us all when King is out of the way." He stopped pacing and thought a moment and was about to say something. He stopped himself and thought better of it. The raid earlier tonight was bound to fuel the Royal and Darrow feud further. As planned, King would blame Darrow and would seek retribution. The plan was working as it was supposed to, unless, he thought to himself, the Laredo kid had a plan to cut his partners out of the deal. Well, two could play that game. Bascom turned to his men and said, "Maybe there's another way we can work this without the kid." "How that?" Pike's interest perked. "Never mind for now," Bascom answered, "but I'm in agreement now. Go ahead and kill the kid, but don't let anyone know about it for a day or two." It was still dark by the time the Laredo kid rode into Green River, but off to the east was just a hint of gray starting to halo around the distant mountains. The street was empty and dark, with only a few windows here and there casting a faint glow of light. Two horses stood hip-shot, tied to the rail in front of the hotel where Bascom was staying. They both had Texas brands, and he was sure these were two of the horses he had seen before, belonging to Pike's men. Whether one of these belonged to Pike himself, he could not be sure. At any rate, two horses meant one of the outlaws was unaccounted for. Glancing up to the second floor, he could see there was a light on in Bascom's room, affirming his hunch that Pike would have gone straight to Bascom to report the trouble they had run into when they scattered the Royal Crown herd. He tied his horse a ways down the street so it wouldn't be spotted when the men came out of the hotel. He had retrieved his lariat from the saddle and then melted into the shadows of the alley between the hotel and the Mercantile. Here he pressed his shoulder against the store wall. From here he could look up and see the window to Bascom's room. It was partially open. As stealthily as possible, the kid worked his way toward the back of the hotel and found a brick chimney that had been built up the side of the hotel from the ground up, extending to well above the roof. He very carefully whirled a loop above his head and let it fly upwards. It settled over the chimney top and he pulled the loop tight. He yanked hard on it a couple of times, making sure it was secure. Then he hopped off the ground, planted his feet on the side of the building, and started to pull and walk up the side of the wall. Once on top of the roof, he tied the rope around his middle and cat-footed over the shingles until he was directly above the window to Bascombe's room. He lay down on the roof and slid toward the edge, taking up slack in the rope to keep himself secured to the chimney so he wouldn't slide off. He lowered his head and shoulders until he could see through the upper part of the window. Even in this upside-down position, he could recognize Pike Grant and Butch Kenningham. He could hear the babble of voices, but it was not too clear. The bottom portion of the window that stood open was still just a little too far to hear, but he could make out that Pike and Butch were the only ones left from the gang and that Bascombe had a plan that Pike seemed to be happy about it. Whether it meant that Bascombe had agreed to eliminate him, which seemed unlikely, since that would leave them all without a chance to make the money they had all hoped for, or Bascombe had other ideas. If so, he couldn't imagine how Bascombe could make the scheme still work without him, unless the alternative that came to him seemed too far-fetched, but nonetheless possible. Just before the two gunnies left Bascombe's room, it did sound like he said something about agreement and the Laredo Kid. The kid quickly pulled himself back up the roof to the chimney, kicked himself over the back edge of the roof, and lowered himself to the ground. He ran quickly to the front of the alley and waited for his quarry to come out of the hotel and get their horses. He looked up at the eastern sky once more, hoping the advancing gray of dawn did not come too soon. He didn't have to wait too long. He could hear Pike and another man talking as they came out of the hotel. They stepped off the board sidewalk, untied their mounts, swung into the saddle, and rode on out of town. The kid darted out of the shadows of alley, ran to his horse, and leaped into the saddle, kicking the black into a gallop after the two gunmen. From his window up above, Seth Bascombe stood watching as the Laredo Kid thundered out of town. He took a slow drag on his cigar and blew the smoke out slowly. His face was as grim as the darkness before the coming dawn. Pike and Butch rode along at a leisurely pace, unaware that the Laredo Kid was on their trail. They would ride out to the Royal Crown Ranch and find a good spot to hunker down and watch for the Laredo Kid to come and go. When the opportune time came, they would follow him and catch him alone someplace where they could ambush him with reasonable chance of success. No way would they want to give the kid any chance to fight back. Pike knew the kid too well for that. The kid was just way too fast and too dangerous for them to take any chances. The kid was close behind. He had traveled fast earlier while darkness hid him on the trail, but as daylight crept over the horizon, he was forced to slacken his pace and keep to the brush and what shadows that still remained. At first, he thought the pair, up ahead, were heading back to the Arrow D, but as their trail continued eastward in a slightly southerly direction, he decided they must be on the way to the Royal Crown. Obviously, they were looking for him. If they were in fact heading toward King Royal's ranch and following the trail, Laredo reasoned that if he cut off a little to the north, he could ride cross-country and arrive back on the trail ahead of Pike and his partner and head them off. With the element of surprise, he could get the drop on them before they would have time to react. He didn't like the idea of an out-and-out ambush, but if it was necessary, he would have to resort to it. Granted, Pike wasn't worth giving a chance to, but somehow the kid felt that if he just shot the pair down, he would be no better than them. But what the hell? He was the Laredo Kid, wasn't he? Or was he? Hell, he didn't know anymore. All he knew was that this business with Pike, Bascombe, Harvey Darrow, the Cordays, and King Royal had to stop. And he would stop it, no matter what he would have to do. No matter who he'd have to kill or how he'd have to do it. Florence awakened with a start. Dawn was just starting to cast its first light and it filtered through the open window of her bedroom. The lacy curtains fluttered in a slight breeze. It was the window that had awakened her as it slid up on a creaking track. She stared into the gloom, trying to focus, to determine just what it was that had awakened her. A shadow moved silently from the darkened wall next to the window. She gasped and held her breath, fearful of the intruder that now crept slowly toward her bed. She was just about to scream when out of the shadows a man stepped close to her bed and leaned down close to her. Florence felt a sense of exhilaration as the man's face became clear. It was Luke. Oh God, yes, it was Luke. Stifling a shout of joy, she jumped up to a sitting position, throwing her arms around him and hugging him tight. "Oh, Luke," she whispered excitedly, "you're alive! And you didn't run off with Millie Corday?" "No, Ma," he reassured her without mentioning that Millie was with him and hiding out in the barn. "Oh, Luke, you came back to your mother. You always were, my boy." She hugged him tighter. "Yes, Ma," he said. "I came back to you." Then he added with ice in his voice, "And I came back to kill Johnny." The sun had barely been up over the horizon when Sam Corday rode his horse into the ranch yard of the Arrow de Harvey. Darrow was standing at the corral talking to one of his hands when Sam rode up close and halted his mount. "What brings you up here so early in the morning, Sam?" Harvey greeted him casually. He started to smile, but it faded quickly as he saw the cold, blank, almost lifeless expression on Sam's face. "Something wrong, Sam?" Darrow asked. Without a word, Corday lifted his big shotgun from its boot and pointed it at Darrow. Darrow shifted on his feet nervously. He was suddenly afraid of the old man. "What is it, Sam?" He heard the hammers click back. The ranch hand cringed back, his trembling hand creeping towards his pistol butt. "For God's sake, Sam, what's wrong?" His words were cut short as the first barrel belched smoke and flame. Darrow's body flew back against the rails, his chest bloodied with a huge gaping hole. Before Darrow's man could pull his weapon, the shotgun bellowed again, cutting him almost in two, as the force lifted him bodily off the ground and tossed him backward to sprawl in a heap on his back in the dirt. Men came running forward from all around the ranch to see what was happening. Sam Corday, without fear or emotion, ignored them, tossed his empty shotgun to the ground, neck-reined his horse in a tight circle, and rode off toward his home on the Wishbone. His brain was swimming with confusion. The voices of Danny, Larry, Millie, Harvey Darrow, Luke Thorne, King Royal, and Johnny Royal echoed unceasingly in his head. He hardly remembered what he had just done. He could only hear the thunder of his shotgun and see blood spattering all around. He had no fear of pursuit and never looked to his back trail. Not even once. He pushed his horse hard, gouging and kicking his ribs and flanks with his heavy boot heels and whipping the poor animal viciously with the reins. The horse was staggering, and lather had foamed over his entire body as Sam Corday brought him to a sliding halt in the ranch yard near his barn. He slid from the saddle with heaviness and tremendous fatigue, left the horse standing there blowing hard and heaving for air, and stumbled into the barn. Larry's body still lay there wrapped in the canvas tarp. "Oh, Larry," he moaned as he dropped to the floor and hugged the bundle. After a moment, he pushed himself over into a sitting position and just stared at the mound next to him for several minutes, thinking, yet not thinking. His face was white, and his eyes dulled. Absently, his hand fumbled inside his coat pocket and pulled out his pipe. It shook in his trembling lips as he struck a match. His eyes focused on the flame as if in a trance. The reflection of the flickering light danced in his vacant eyes. Slowly, the match burnt halfway down the stick, and without conscious thought, Sam Corday let it slip from his finger into the pile of straw next to him. Chapter 21. The Laredo Kid had himself perched high above the trail and well hidden behind a large boulder and some scrub brush. He had left his horse tied back in the brush, but he had taken his saddlebag from behind the saddle and his Winchester rifle with him. Here he waited, watching the trail patiently with the rifle barrel propped over the top of the boulder. He was sure he had reached this spot in the trail before Pike and Kenyon, and soon he was assured he was right as he heard the steady clip-clop of horses' hooves approaching. As the two riders came into view, Laredo squeezed off a shot. The bullet plowed into the dirt just ahead of Pike's horse. Both riders pulled up abruptly, their mounts stamping and rearing with the suddenness. "Hold it right there, boys," Laredo shouted, "and keep your hands away from your guns." Pike settled his mount and squinted up toward the kid's perch. "Kid," he shouted in query. "Yeah, it's me, Pike," the kid replied. "Get your hands up and keep him high." Butch glanced questioningly to Pike. "Go ahead, Butch," Pike told him, raising both hands, reins held in his left. "Do as the man says." Then, to Laredo, he shouted back, "What's this all about, kid?" "No use pretending, Pike," the kid answered. "I know you think I double-crossed you, and now you're out to get even." "You trying to tell me you didn't double-cross us?" Pike sneered. "I'm telling you that Bascom never would have sent you out after me if he didn't have a way to double-cross us all. Think about it. Why would he allow you to kill me when he needs me to inherit the royal crown?" Pike didn't answer right away, not sure if he should reveal what Bascom had said. He said there was another way around it. He wouldn't need you. He didn't tell you what it was, though. No, he didn't. Pike was finally beginning to see what the kid was getting at. "That means he probably doesn't need you either, Pike." "You don't know that," Pike answered back, but something in his voice assured the kid that Pike was now having his doubts. "Pike," Laredo said, "I could have shot you both down from ambush without giving you a chance. I don't want to kill you unless I have to, but I won't let you kill me first, so I want to make you a deal." "A deal? What kind of a deal can you make me?" The kid didn't answer right away. Pike thought a moment, then supplied, "Oh, I get it. You want me to get Bascom out of the way? Then the deal is the same. You inherit the ranch. We live on Easy Street. I think I can live with that." A grin began to spread across his face. "No, that's not what I had in mind," the kid answered flatly. Pike's grin began to fade as suddenly as it started. The kid tossed his saddlebags, and they landed spread-eagled in the dust of the trail several yards in front of Pike's horse. The horse shied a step backwards. "There's $7,000 in those bags, Pike. It's all yours. Yours and Butch's. All you have to do is pick it up and ride out of Wyoming right now." He decided to use Butch for leverage. "Doesn't that sound good to you, Butch?" Butch darted a glance toward Pike. He licked his dry lips and said, "Maybe we ought to take it, Pike." "Shut up, Butch. I do the thinking around here." "Better take it, Pike. There's nothing else to get. The whole Johnny Royal impersonation is over. King already knows the truth. You're just saying that to cut us out." Pike seemed to be trying to convince himself. "I'm telling you, Pike, take the money and ride out. That's all you're going to get that you're going to want. The only thing else you can get is a bullet and a graveyard plot." The kid's voice was firm and matter-of-fact. "What's it going to be, Pike?" "Oh, let's take it, Pike," Butch stammered, half expecting Pike to chastise him again. Pike stared at him for a moment and grimaced, then shouted back toward the kid, "All right, kid, you win." He started to dismount slowly. "You're making the right choice, Pike," Laredo assured him. Pike moved slowly down the trail, careful to keep his hands high and away from his gun. As he came within reach of the saddlebags, he leaned down and picked them up with his right hand. As he stood back up, a thought ran through his head. Something about having the money and killing the kid, too. Then he did something stupid. As he lifted the saddlebags to hip level, he let them slip from his hand and it darted toward his pistol butt. Pike's eyes widened with surprise, and his body stiffened erect as the kid's Winchester roared and a .44 .40 slug ripped into his chest. His hand was still frozen on the pistol butt, and the shooter was only halfway out of its holster. He teetered on wobbly legs for a moment or two, then crumpled into heap, face down, in the middle of the trail. Kenyon's mount shied at the noise, then settled down as Butch reined him tight. The outlaw's face was white with fear and disbelief at what he had just witnessed. He was too frightened to reach for his gun, even though he feared that the kid would gun him down for sure. "Seems like you're the smart one of the bunch, Butch," Laredo said as he stood up from behind the rock and started to descend the bank toward the trail. He still held his Winchester high. Are you going to shoot me?" Kenyon was almost babbling with fear. "Not if you do what I tell you," Laredo answered. "Anything," Butch stammered. "I'll do anything you say. Just don't kill me." Laredo chuckled. "All you have to do is take that saddlebag full of money in Pike's body and ride out of this country just like I told Pike before." Butch almost sighed with relief. He couldn't believe his ears or his good fortune. Chapter 22. It was mid-morning by the time the Laredo Kid returned to Green River. With Pike Grant and his bunch out of the way, that left only Seth Bascom to be dealt with. Somehow, he needed to resolve this situation without Bascom revealing him as the Laredo Kid, and as yet he had no plan how to do that, short of killing the man. Too many had already died because of his impersonation, and as much as he hoped there would be no more killing, he was afraid that it couldn't be avoided. As the kid rode down the main street, he noticed a large crowd milling about in front of the sheriff's office. There were several horses tied up nearby along the street, all wearing an Aero D brand. Sheriff Ben Stryker was outside, peering into a parked wagon, looking at the load covered by a canvas tarp. As he rode close, he called to the Stryker, "What seems to be the problem?" Ben looked up at the passing rider, squinting a little with the sun in his eye. "Oh, hello, Johnny. It's Harvey Darrow and one of Hans." He gestured toward the wagon load. "They've been shot." Johnny reined up sharply. "Dead," he heard Stryker say. His mind was racing. Why would Bascom or Pike have done this? It didn't make sense. Then, through his foggy thoughts, he heard the sheriff add, "Sam Corday shot them both with a shotgun early this morning." "Sam Corday?" Johnny answered. "Why would he do that?" "Dunno." He shook his head. "We'll probably never know. Darrow's men said it looked like Sam was out of his head. Trailed him home and found he had burned his barn down. Looks like he was still in it." Johnny felt sick. His stomach churned as he envisioned what had happened. He must have blamed Darrow for the stampede and Larry's death. Sam had never been a strong man, and the events of the past couple of weeks had been enough to send him over the edge. This was just one more thing that he and Bascom were going to have to pay for. Johnny found it hard to say anything in response. He didn't need to, for Ben said, "What brings you to town, son?" "Just a little business, Ben. I'd best be getting to it." He kneed his mount forward and continued slowly down the street. Stryker watched him go for a moment. A little concern was in his eyes as he pondered the strange expression on Johnny's face and the tone of his voice. Dispelling his thoughts of Johnny, he returned to his examination of the bodies. The kid was in a killing mood by the time he reached the hotel. He was angry enough to ignore the desk clerk's claim that Bascom had left early that morning. He stormed upstairs and burst into Bascom's room, only to find the man was indeed not there. He hurried to the Longhorn. Bascom must be there. But he wasn't. In fact, the place was practically empty. The bartender said he had seen Bascom riding out of town on a rented livery horse. The kid now knew his hunch was right, and was sure he knew where Bascom was headed. Without a word of thanks to the barkeep, the kid had hurried outside and practically ran down the street to where he had left his horse in front of the hotel. He was about to mount up when he heard a voice call, "Johnny! Wait!" He turned to see a pinto horse racing down the street. Lila Royal in divided riding skirt, and her uncovered hair flying back behind her in the breeze, slid her pony to a halt, the shod hoofs digging up clods of fresh dirt in the roadway. "What now?" thought Johnny. The girl seemed to be in a panic and was breathing hard as she slid from the saddle before the horse had even come to a stop. She ran toward him. "Johnny! Johnny!" she repeatedly shouted as she ran to him and flung her arms around his neck and buried her face into his chest. She was breathing hard and she was trembling. Johnny reflexively responded, reaching his arms about her and holding her tight, trying to calm her down. "Calm down," he whispered and stroked her hair. "Calm down and tell me what's happened. What's wrong?" For several seconds they stood there in embrace. Townspeople were starting to stop and stare. Across the street, coming out of the general store, Abby Stryker, in divided riding skirt and boots, halted abruptly, noticing the couple. Her eyes darkened, and she felt anger start to swell up inside her. Not just with Johnny and Lila, but with herself, for she had foolishly withheld information from her father because she was interested in this young man, and she didn't care who he really was. And now, watching Johnny and Lila in an embrace that suggested more than a brother and sister relationship, she knew that there would never be a chance for her. Lila finally calmed down enough to blurt it out. "Oh, Johnny, Luke's come back. He's hiding out in the barn waiting for you to come home. He plans to kill you. I heard him tell Mother. I knew you had gone to town last night, so I sneaked out when no one could see me. I had to warn you before you returned." Johnny pushed her back a little, still holding her arms, and looked into her tear-filled eyes. He half smiled, although with a bit of embarrassment, and said, "Don't worry. Luke's not going to kill me. I appreciate the concern and the warning, but it's not the end of the world. Now, if you can compose yourself enough to ride back, I think we'd better be going right away. We can talk more on the way." She nodded agreement, and he helped her back into the saddle. Then he mounted up and they both rode out of town, headed for home. Abby Stryker watched them go. Luke Thorne was lying on the floor of the hayloft, peering out through the partially opened door, close to the peak of the barn, and watching the trail leading up to the ranch house. Millie Corday sat on a pile of hay beside him, just looking at him, still remembering how she had thought she had lost him, just days before. Why she cared so much for the big galoot, she couldn't tell herself. And although she had wanted him to just ride as far away as possible with her, she still stood by him, accepting his thirst for vengeance against Johnny Royal. The trail had remained empty all morning, and there had been little activity around the ranch house, since Florence had told Harka and the remaining riders that King wanted them out on the range helping to round up the scattered cattle from the night before. As the morning wore on, Luke began to doze as he lay there on the floor, waiting. His eyes would flutter shut for a few moments, and then he would jerk himself awake until he began to doze again. It was in one of these moments that he had forced himself awake, that he saw the movement on the trail. All at once he was alert, and he rose to his knees, lifting his rifle to the ready. Far down the trail, he could see a moving shadowed dot of a rider and horse. Dust clouds billowed up behind them. Luke's heart began to beat faster with anticipation, and his hands became moist with sweat. Millie moved to his side and he pushed her back. "Stay back. I don't want you getting hurt." Is it him?" Millie asked, suddenly sensing the danger and feeling apprehension. "Can't tell yet," Luke whispered, "but whoever it is riding fast." They waited until the rider was close enough to make out. Luke felt a pang of frustration, and at the same time stifled a sense of relief, which he denied to himself, when he saw the rider was not Johnny Royal. As the rider came closer, he could see the man on the horse was not wearing range clothes, but a gray suit, which was most unsuitable for the trail. Finally, he could recognize the man as he guided his rented bay horse into the ranch yard. It was Seth Bascom. The crowd had dispersed, and Ben Stryker was now alone in his office when Abby burst through the doorway. He looked up with surprise as she slammed the door behind her and ran to him. "Abby," he said, "what in the world is the matter?" "Oh, Dad," she said. She looked like a schoolgirl who had just been caught in mischief by the teacher. "I've been such a fool." "What in the world are you talking about, girl? One would think you've committed a crime." "I might as well have," she said, handing him a sheet of paper. "What's this?" the sheriff queried, taking it. "It's a wanted poster. It came in the mail some time back, but I didn't give it to you." "Oh, Dad, I'm so sorry." Stryker's thick brows pulled together as he gazed at the poster. Now it all made sense to him, and he could guess why she had withheld it from him. The likeness on the poster resembled Johnny Royal, but the name of the outlaw affixed to the poster was the Laredo Kid. Stryker cast an accusing look at his daughter, but refrained from chastising her. "Does anyone else know about this?" he asked. "No, it was in an envelope when I picked it up from the post office. This is the first time I've shown it to anyone," she confessed. "Abby, you should have shown this to me before, but I'm not going to lecture you about it. I can guess your reasons for it." She flushed with embarrassment. "Why are you telling me now?" her father asked. "Well, I'd rather not say, but—" "I can guess that too," Stryker interrupted. "I saw him and Lila ride out of town together a few minutes ago." Then he folded the poster, stuffed it inside his shirt pocket, and stood up from his desk to retrieve his hat from the wall hook, and said, "King needs to know about this right away. I've got to go to the Royal Crown and tell him. If the Laredo Kid is there when I get there, I'll arrest him." "Dad," Abby said with a plea in her tone, "I want to go with you." "No, you'd better stay here. If this boy is really the Laredo Kid, it could be dangerous for you," Stryker said. "Just the same, I still want to go. Besides, I don't think he would hurt me." Stryker thought for a moment. "No," he said idly. "I don't think he would." Florence answered the front door. She had given Elvira and the other servants the day off and had sent them to their quarters. She had not wanted to risk anyone finding out that Luke was nearby. She was a bit surprised when she swung the door open and found Seth Bascom standing there before her. He smiled broadly and swept off his white beaver hat, bowing ever so slightly with the best of gentlemanly manners. Florence flustered a bit, glanced over her shoulder furtively to see if anyone could see them at the doorway, and said, almost in a whisper, "Why, Mr. Bascom, this is a surprise. What brings you out here this morning?" "I came to tell you, madam, that I decided to accept the offer you made me the other day. That is, if the offer still stands." Florence Royal glanced behind her one more time, then squeezed through the door and pulled it shut behind her, at the same time pushing Seth Bascom back further onto the porch. There was a look of urgency on her face. She glanced toward the barn, knowing Luke was there waiting to solve the problem of King's son. Her first thought was, she didn't need Bascom anymore, but then she thought the boy's death would settle better with King if he were convinced that the man he thought to be his son was an imposter. It still stands. $50,000 if you convince the old man you made a mistake. You showed me the money the other day. Do you still have it with you? Yes, I never got around to putting it back in the bank. I've got it in my room, she said. Good, Bascom said, but if you don't mind, I'd like to see it first. Not that I don't trust you, but I need to be careful. You understand? Yes, I understand, Florence said with annoyance. You can see the money, but if the old man doesn't buy your story, you're not getting anything. Understood? Bascom nodded. Understood. Johnny and Lila reined up behind a stand of trees along the ridge above the Royal Crown Ranch buildings and corrals. Johnny assumed Luke would be watching the main trail to the ranch from the front of the barn, so they had circled around to approach from the opposite direction. From here, Johnny hoped he could ride up to the rear of the barn without being seen. If he could sneak inside the barn and take Luke by surprise, he might be able to avoid any more killing. You stay here, Lila, Johnny said. It was an order. He gigged his mount forward and started slowly down the incline. Be careful, Johnny, Lila tried to shout in a whisper as she watched him go. He never looked back. As the Laredo Kid approached the barn, he could see the roan in the otherwise empty small corral. The horse whickered as if he knew his friend was near. He trotted close to the rails as the kid passed him by, ignoring him. He shook his head as if indignant. Stealthily, the kid crept toward the back door to the barn. He removed his spurs to keep their jingling from announcing his approach and pushed the door open a crack. It creaked slightly on worn hinges. He froze momentarily, listening for any sounds from within that might indicate that he had been heard. When he was finally satisfied that, so far, his presence had not been detected, he carefully moved the door inward a half-inch at a time until the space was large enough to slip through. Luke was nowhere to be seen on the ground floor. The kid was then sure that he must be in the hayloft. That would be a good place to hide, and he could watch the trail out the haymow door and wait in ambush. As the kid approached the ladder to the hayloft, he could hear a murmur of voices. Damn, he thought, he's not alone. Millie must be with him. This could make surprise even more difficult. Carefully, he placed his hands on the sides of the ladder, reaching as far up as he could, and placed one booted foot on the first rung and lifted himself up. Careful, don't make a sound, he told himself as he gained his perch on each step, slowly taking one rung at a time before proceeding to the next one. As he neared the top of the ladder, he could hear the conversation a little clearer. He knew now that it was Millie with him. What's that Jasper doing here? Luke was saying as if to himself and not asking for an answer. He'd better be gone before Johnny gets here or it can mess everything up. The kid took no time to wonder what Luke was talking about. He took advantage of the sound of Luke's voice to cover the sound of catapulting himself above the ladder opening into the loft. In that swift moment of attack, the kid saw Luke, down on one knee, rifle in hand, pointing the barrel out the partially opened haymow door. Millie screamed as the kid's body dove past her. Luke twisted around in the same instant. Too late. The kid had already tackled him around the waist and was pulling Luke back, off balance away from the door and rolling sideways into the hay. Millie jumped to her feet and out of the way as the kid and Luke fell to the spot she had been occupying. The surprise action had caught Luke off guard. He had suddenly reacted without realization of what had happened. Out of instinct, he rolled over with the lighter weight kid on top. Luke braced his feet against the floor and heaved himself to his feet and tried to bring the rifle around to bear as his assailant stumbled backward a step and released his grip. Seeing the rifle swing around, the kid dove at Luke and reached out with both hands, one on the rifle barrel and one on the stock, and pushed it up and away from him at the same time, trying to twist it out of Luke's grasp. It was at this point that the two men came face to face, inches apart. Luke's angry eyes bulged with fury, and for the first time he recognized the man he knew as Johnny Royal. He screamed with rage, his mouth gaping wide, and lunged forward. The kid's muscles strained, trying to push back the assault. Sweat poured down his face and dripped into his eyes as he fell backwards to the floor, still maintaining his iron grip on the weapon. Luke fell forward after him, pinning the kid's back to the floor, and as he pushed the rifle and the kid's arms above his head, the kid doubled his knees and planted both boots into Luke's midsection and kicked with all his strength, at the same time releasing his grasp on the rifle. Luke's body flew backward, and he landed flat on his back with a tremendous thud. Hay dust billowed up around him. The jolt knocked the wind out of him, and the rifle fell from his hands to lie behind him. The kid started to push himself to his feet and dive after his opponent, but as he reached his knees, his eyes widened with surprise as he saw the deadly gleam of pitchfork tines and the rage in Millie's face. Chapter 23. King Royal, sitting behind his desk in the study, glanced up from the wanted poster in his hand and glared at Seth Bascom. "You're telling me that you brought an imposter here and bilked me out of $10,000? I ought to shoot you where you stand." He cast a stray glance to his holster and pistol hanging on a wall peg to the right of where Florence stood. "But I wouldn't want to dirty my floor up with your filthy blood," he sighed. "Well, Mr. Royal," Bascombe said a bit shakily, trying not to stammer, "I assure you, I fully believed he was truly Johnny Royal when I found him. I just now discovered I was wrong." "You really expect me to believe this hogwash?" King scoffed. "How much is she paying you to tell me this?" He nodded toward Flo. She sucked in a deep breath. Bascombe didn't answer right away, and King repeated the question, this time to Florence. "Well, woman," he demanded, "how much are you paying him?" She started to speak, but somehow the words stuck in her throat. "Come on, out with it. How much?" 50,000, she almost whispered it. She looked down at the envelope in her trembling hands. "Nice deal for you, Bascombe," King chided. 10,000 from me, not to mention the bonus I gave you, and 50,000 from my wife. You steal $60,000 from us and you never had to draw a gun. I have to hand it to you. You're a slick one, all right." King forced a wry little smile. Bascombe felt compelled to try to smile along with him, but wiped it away quickly when King's face turned dark and grim. "Now let me tell you both something." Royal almost growled it between clenched teeth. "What you're selling now doesn't amount to a hill of beans. I've known about Johnny Royal and the Laredo Kid ever since the day I was shot. The kid told me the truth on the way back to the ranch, and guess what? I didn't care. He's the kind of man I wanted for a son, and that's the way I'm going to keep it. As far as I'm concerned, he is my son, and he will someday control this ranch." He glanced toward Flo. "Whether you like it or not, my dear, this ranch will never belong to you. Now give your friend here that money." He nodded toward the envelope. "And you, Mr. Bascombe," he added, "take your payoff money and get out of here. You mention anything about the Laredo Kid to anyone, and I'll have your hide. You got that?" "Yes, sir," Bascombe conceded meekly, taking the envelope and stuffing in his inside coat pocket. Suddenly, a rifle shot sounded from outside. All heads jerked in surprise. No more firing followed the single report. Florence started to smile. "That's my Luke putting an end to your precious so-called son, King. He's been waiting for him to ride in. And now it looks like I've beaten you, my dear husband." King glared with rage and tried to push himself up from his desk, but his leg didn't permit him, and he fell heavily back into his chair. The door of the study burst open, and Heather rushed in excitedly. "Mother, King, what's going on? What was that shooting? And what's this man doing here?" "Never mind," Florence ordered. "Mr. Bascombe was just leaving." She flashed him warning eyes. "Why, yes, ma'am," he replied, turning and crowding Heather aside in the doorway as he hurried out. Flo turned back to King, victory glowing in her face. She reached up and drew the pistol from King's holster and, holding with two hands, pointed directly at the old man. "Mother," Heather exclaimed, "what are you doing?" She didn't answer. She just eared back the hammer until it clicked into place. "So, you're finally getting around to it," King said coolly. "Somehow, I always knew you would, but I kept telling myself you weren't that bad." "Bad?" she sneered. "I'm no worse than you." "No," King Royal sighed remorsefully, "but you'll still never get the royal crown." His words were cut off with the blasting sound of the pistol going off. King slumped over his desk, red stains spreading out over his papers and ink blotter. Flo stood there a moment, holding the smoldering pistol in her hands. Her face was twisted with hate, and her eyes were blank. "Mother!" Heather shouted from behind her. She suddenly came aware of what she had done. She dropped the weapon as if it was burning her fingers. As it clattered to the floor, she gathered up her skirts, turned, and ran out of the study toward the front door. As she flung the front door open, she could see Seth Bascombe had already mounted his horse and was just starting to ride out of the yard. "Luke!" Florence shouted wildly. "Shoot that man! Don't let him get away!" Bascom seemed to hesitate momentarily, glancing back at the screaming woman who came running off the porch. He didn't see the rifle barrel protruding from the hayloft door in the peak of the barn. He probably didn't even hear its sharp report as it blasted once, driving a slug into the middle of Bascom's chest. His body arched, his arms flung upward, his horse rearing on 2 feet, spilling the rider to the ground and trotting away. Bascom's body rolled over in the dirt, leaving the man spread-eagled on his back, a massive stain of blood over the front of his fancy white shirt. "Oh, Luke!" Flo shouted as she ran toward the barn. "You did it! You did it! Your mother's so proud of you." But then, as she neared the barn, she slid to an abrupt halt, a quizzical expression on her wildly flushed face. From out of the darkness of the barn interior, a shadow emerged, dusty boots visible at first, and the shape of a rifle swinging next to the striding legs. Into the sunlight, no longer a shadow, the Laredo Kid stepped through the open barn door. Flo's face went ashen as the blood drained from it, and she suddenly felt weak, fear welling up inside her. "Why, you—" she managed to get it out. "You're supposed to be dead. Luke shot you. I heard it." The kid just stood there staring at her with a mixture of hate and pity, all at the same time. She was processing this revelation, realizing the truth, and at the same time trying to deny it to herself. Before she could bring herself to utter another word, Ben and Abby Stryker rode into the yard and reined up. "What's going on here?" Stryker bellowed, pointing to Bascom's body. Even in her state of shock, Florence's instinct for self-survival kicked in. "That man robbed us and killed King," she babbled. Laredo's fears were realized. He was sure now that Florence had shot King. Bascom had already been outside when he heard the shot. "That's the truth! Tell them that's the truth, Heather!" The girl had just run up to her mother and held her. She looked up at the sheriff, still in the saddle, and said, "Yes, that's the truth, Sheriff. I saw it." She tried not to look at Laredo, knowing that he knew better. Laredo didn't dispute it, but he couldn't resist telling them the truth about King Royal. "Too bad," he said. "King was a dying man anyways. Doc Tatum had been treating him for quite some time. The old man didn't have much time left." He could see the shock in both Florence's and Heather's faces. He was satisfied to know that Florence would have to live with the fact that she had shot her husband for nothing. "Who shot him?" the sheriff asked, pointing toward Bascom. "I did," the kid admitted. It was true, and he saw no point in trying to put the blame on Flo for shooting King, so he left it at that. Stryker drew his pistol from its holster and pointed it directly at the kid. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to arrest you." "Drop your guns." "You're arresting me for shooting Bascom?" the kid asked as he tossed the rifle to the ground and began to unbuckle his gun belts. "No," Stryker said flatly. "I'm arresting you for all the crimes you're wanted for, Laredo Kid." The kid didn't really look surprised. He glanced toward Abby, and she looked away from him. Heather seemed to be genuinely surprised, and although she had been attracted to this young man, she felt relieved that the sheriff would be more concerned with him than in investigating her mother's part in King Royal's death. "I knew there was something fishy about this man, Sheriff," Flo said. Then, to Laredo, "You came here with this man, Bascom, just to get money from us," she accused. Then her befuddled mind began to clear, and she remembered about Luke. "Luke, my boy Luke, what have you done with him?" Hysteria was starting to rise in her voice, knowing full well what she might hear. Laredo looked away from her and directly up at Stryker. "I didn't do anything to Luke. Millie did. She came at me with a pitchfork. When I moved out of the way, she accidentally got Luke instead. Then, when she came at me again, I got hold of Luke's rifle and shot her." He turned toward Flo and said calmly, "I'm afraid they're both dead." Florence screamed and ran into the barn just as Lila rode into the yard. She saw the body on the ground and Sheriff Stryker holding the man she knew as Johnny Royal at gunpoint. "What's going on here?" she asked excitedly. Chapter 24. It was almost midnight. The cell was dark and dank, and the cot had a sagging rack of springs. The mattress smelled of mildew and the body odors of previous occupants. Although he had been in jail before, the Laredo Kid had found it impossible to sleep. The events of the last few weeks kept haunting him, and as much as he oft-times had been angry with King Royal, and as many times as he had disagreed with the old man's ruthlessness, he couldn't help but mourn the Cattle King's death. As much as he hated Florence for killing him, he also felt sorry for the loss of her son. There had been no need to try to turn the sheriff against her. She had been punished already. Too bad about Millie. She never deserved her fate. Somehow, he wished he had let her do him in. He really didn't know why he shot her. It was just an instinctive, reflexive action acquired in his life as an outlaw. It was deathly quiet here in the cell. The deputy in the front office, keeping guard, had probably gone to sleep, as well as the rest of the townspeople, for the streets were just as quiet and dark. Only the sound of crickets and peepers crept through the barred window above his head. It was perhaps a half-hour later when he heard the stirring in the front office. And then a mumble of voices. Footsteps sounded in the ante-way, and he could hear the jingle of keys. In a moment, the outer door opened and the deputy stepped forward. In the dimness, Laredo could barely make out the look of consternation and apprehension in the man's face. As he came near, he rattled the keys and shook them out, finding the cell door key and inserting it in the lock. Laredo came off the bunk and hurried to the door. As it swung open, the kid could see Harka directly behind the deputy. The Indian had a pistol pressed into the small of the lawman's back. He nodded for the deputy to step aside and motioned the kid to come out. Within a matter of seconds, Harka had pushed the deputy into the cell, locked it, and took the keys with him. The kid found his pistol belts in the sheriff's desk drawer, and they went outside to awaiting horses. Harka had his sugan tied behind the cantle, as if ready for traveling. As they rode out of town, Harka dropped the jail cell keys in the dirt at the end of the street. The two riders then rode on silently into the dark. As usual, Harka had little to say, only occasional words and grunts. At first, the kid thought they were riding out of the country, but after a while, it became evident that they were headed back toward the Royal Crown Ranch. Ordinarily, Laredo would not think this was a particularly prudent thing to do, but he figured Harka had some sort of plan in mind, and he had no other alternative other than going along with him. The ranch house was dark and quiet when they rode into the yard. It looked like everyone must be asleep, if that was possible after the day's ordeal. Laredo wondered about Lila and Heather and what would happen to them. Florence would never be able to run an empire such as the Royal Crown. It would eventually be broken up into pieces, and the kingdom would be lost forever. Harka dismounted and went into the house, without even a nod to Laredo. Laredo sat there a moment listening to the night sounds. From the small corral, he heard the whicker of the hammerhead roan. He neck-reined his own mount and guided it toward the corral. The roan trotted up to him, and he reached out and patted the horse on its neck. As he did so, his gaze drifted back toward the house. He saw a light go on briefly in Florence's room, and then flicker out just as quickly, leaving the window in total darkness. A moment later, Harka stepped out onto the porch and strode toward his horse. It was hard to tell in the darkness, but it looked like the Indian was sheathing his knife as he walked. Without looking around for the kid, Harka stepped into the stirrup, swung into the saddle, and prodded his pony forward, first into a trot, then a gallop, and disappeared into the darkness of the trail. The kid could only guess what had happened, and decided it was time to go. He opened the corral gate and let the roan out. Then he spurred his horse and rode off with the roan tagging along behind. 2 days later, the Laredo Kid crossed over the border into Utah. The wind had whipped up into a frenzy, and dust was blowing in dark clouds, so thick at times that it seemed almost impossible to see. During one of the intermittent breaks that visibility was somewhat clear, the kid had topped a ridge and had spotted a herd of wild horses roaming in the valley below. He dismounted and stepped up alongside the roan. "Well, old boy," Laredo said, "this time there is no going back. I'd like to keep you, but you shouldn't have to belong to anyone any more than I should. You and I are like the wind, coming from nowhere and going nowhere. Like it or not, that's all the freedom there is. So, go on, fella." He slapped the roan affectionately on its rump and sent him down the slope into the valley. The wind picked up again. For a moment, the roan was hidden from view by the dust cloud, and when it cleared away, he was gone. The man known as the Laredo Kid swung into the saddle, turned his mount, and rode off just as the wind picked up again and was swallowed up by the dust-filled air. When it finally subsided, then wind seemed to cease permanently. No more howling, no more flying dust and debris, just the clearness of an empty blue sky hanging over the distant horizon.